The golden rule on Lycaon Prime was simple: never corner an alpha. Princess Kaelin was about to remind the entire royal court exactly why that rule was written in blood. Centuries of genetic tampering had transformed the inhabitants of Lycaon Prime into apex predators wrapped in high society finery. They were wolf-human hybrids, governed by a rigid hierarchy of bloodlines and pack laws. The ruling class resided in sanitized, floating citadels constructed of glass and polished chrome, looking down upon the industrial smog of the lower sectors. Kaelin, the direct heir to the Alpha throne, despised every inch of her gilded cage. The court whispered about her behind silk fans, calling her the feral princess, while her peers bathed in synthetic ultraviolet light and engaged in polite, venomous politics. Kaelin preferred the irradiated borderlands. She ran with the wild beasts, her hands stained with the soil of an untamed planet, her instincts sharpened by genuine survival rather than simulated combat. Today was the grand mating rite, an archaic tradition disguised as a diplomatic gala. The great hall of the royal palace was suffocating. Heavy velvet drapes blocked out the natural sunlight, replaced by the sterile glow of chandeliers. Hundreds of elite, pure-blood suitors paraded across the marble floor, presenting themselves to the High Council and to her. Kaelin sat beside her father, the Alpha King, her posture rigid, her amber eyes burning with barely concealed rage. She wore ceremonial armor that felt more like a straitjacket, her wild, dark hair forced into an intricate braid. Lord Vargas, a powerful and ruthless rival clan leader with a gaze like a trapped snake, stepped forward to present his eldest son. The young lord approached the dais. He was arrogant, heavily muscled but soft around the edges, reeking of expensive colognes designed to mask the scent of his own profound mediocrity. He bowed, an exaggerated motion of false respect, and then reached out to claim Kaelin's chin, a traditional gesture of dominance meant to seal the courtship. Kaelin moved faster than the royal guards could process. She did not growl, and she did not warn him. She seized his outstretched wrist, twisted her body, and applied the exact amount of torque required to shatter the joint. The suitor collapsed to the marble floor, screaming in agony. Chaos erupted in the great hall. Courtiers scrambled backward. The king roared a command, a booming sound that shook the very foundations of the room. A dozen heavily armed royal guards, clad in powered exosuits, surged toward the dais. Kaelin was already in motion. She vaulted over the ceremonial table, scattering ancient chalices and diplomatic treaties, and sprinted toward the grand stained-glass window that overlooked the sprawling city below. She did not hesitate. Kaelin threw her shoulder forward and shattered the glass, launching herself into the freezing high-altitude air. She plummeted toward the smog-choked layers of the lower city, the wind tearing the ceremonial braid from her hair. She twisted in mid-air, her enhanced physiology calculating distance and trajectory in fractions of a second. She caught a massive, sweeping ventilation pipe, her reinforced boots skidding against the slick metal, slowing her descent. Below her lay the industrial underbelly of the capital. It was a labyrinth of steam vents, rusted catwalks, and forgotten machinery. This was the domain of the pure humans, the descendants of the original colonists who had never undergone the genetic splicing. They were treated as a lower caste, relegated to maintaining the massive life support and power systems that kept the elite floating above them. Kaelin dropped from the pipe, navigating a treacherous maze of narrow alleys and hanging cables. The air down here tasted like copper and ozone. She could hear the distinct, heavy thud of the royal guards dropping into the sector behind her, their scanners sweeping the area. She needed cover, and she needed it immediately. She leaped toward a slanted roof constructed of rusted corrugated metal, intending to slide into the shadows. The metal, weakened by years of acidic rain, completely gave way, Kaelin crashed through the ceiling in a shower of rust, dust, and debris. She landed heavily on a solid wooden surface, smashing an array of delicate, glowing circuitry into unrecognizable fragments. She rolled perfectly, coming to a crouched, defensive stance on top of what remained of a cluttered workbench. She bared her fangs, her muscles coiled tight, ready to slaughter whatever low-level gang enforcer or mechanic dared to challenge her. As the dust settled, she found herself staring at a man. He stood a few feet away, holding a half-welded plasma manifold in one hand and a cooling torch in the other. He was human. His clothes were stained with grease, and heavy protective goggles were pushed up onto his forehead, revealing tired, deeply intelligent eyes. He looked at the gaping hole in his ceiling, then down at his ruined workbench, and finally at the terrifying feral predator crouching amidst his tools. Elias Thorne let out a long, exhausted breath. He did not scream. He did not drop to his knees in terror. "Do you have any idea how hard it is to source uncorrupted beryllium in this sector?" Elias asked, his voice entirely devoid of panic. Kaelin narrowed her eyes. This was not the reaction she expected. She released a heavy, concentrated wave of alpha pheromones. It was a biological command, an invisible force that forced lesser beings to lower their heads and submit to her will. Even the most hardened criminals in the lower sectors would normally collapse weeping under such pressure. Elias blinked, then waved his hand casually in front of his face. "Whatever cologne you are wearing, it smells like an electrical fire. Are you going to pay for my roof?" Humans lacked the biological receptors for Lycaean dominance cues. Kaelin knew this from her history tutors. But she also knew that humans were physically fragile and universally terrified of her kind. They submitted out of fear, if not biology. Yet, this man simply looked annoyed. He treated the deadliest woman on the planet like a rogue pigeon that had flown into his living room. She stood up slowly, towering over him, ensuring he could see the blood still staining her ceremonial gauntlets. "I am Princess Kaelin of the Alpha bloodline. I am hunted by the King's Guard. If you speak to me with disrespect again, I will tear your throat out and use your spine as a belt." Elias tossed the plasma manifold onto a side table. "Great. A royal fugitive. Just what my Tuesday was missing. If you are going to kill me, do it outside. I just swept the floors." Kaelin stared at him, genuinely bewildered. Her anger evaporated, replaced by a sharp, calculating intrigue. Her mind raced back to the discovery she had made weeks ago in the dead zones of the feral territories. She had found a signal, an ancient rhythmic pulse broadcasting from beneath the toxic soil. It was not of Lycaean origin. It was something older, something buried before the genetic splicing had even begun. She had realized instantly that to uncover its source, she needed technical expertise that did not rely on the sanitized, heavily monitored network of the High Council. She needed an engineer who lived off the grid. More importantly, she needed someone who was not bound by the biological subservience of her people. She needed someone who would not paralyze with fear the moment she gave an order. Someone capable of thinking clearly while standing next to an apex predator. As she listened to the distant, echoing shouts of her father's guards drawing closer through the alleyways, Kaelin made a decision that would forever alter the fate of their world. She stepped off the ruined workbench and walked slowly toward the human, a dangerous smile touching the corners of her mouth. The High Council was hunting her, but they had no idea what she was about to unearth. Stepping back into the glittering viper's nest of the Alpha Court was a death sentence. But Kaelin had never been one to shy away from an execution. She just planned on being the one holding the axe. Less than 3 hours after shattering the arm of Lord Vargas's heir and diving out of a stained glass window, the feral princess simply walked through the colossal main doors of the royal palace. The royal sentries, clad in their heavy exosuits, stood frozen in absolute disbelief. They had been tearing the lower industrial sectors apart looking for her. Yet here she was, strolling past the marble pillars with the casual grace of a predator returning to its den. She was not alone. Flanked by two thoroughly confused guards she had commandeered at the gate. Kalen dragged a grease-stained human mechanic into the center of the grand hall. Elias Thorne looked wildly out of place. His heavy boots left oily smudges on the pristine white floors, and he was still clutching a specialized hydrospanner like it was a defensive weapon. The hundreds of aristocratic wolf-human hybrids in the room fell into a stunned, breathless silence. The sheer audacity of bringing a lower-caste human into the sacred diplomatic space was unthinkable. The Alpha King rose from his throne, his face a storm of fury and relief. Before he could utter a single booming command, Kalen raised her hand, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings with absolute authority. She declared that the mating rite was concluded. She had made her choice, and her chosen consort was the human engineer standing beside her. The silence shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces of outrage. A collective gasp rippled through the pureblood suitors. To reject an alpha was a scandal. To replace an alpha with a physically fragile, unenhanced human was a declaration of war against the very foundation of their society. Standing in the shadows of the colonnade, Lord Vargas watched the chaos unfold with cold, reptilian satisfaction. His son was currently in the medical wing having his bones fused back together. A humiliation that demanded blood, but Vargas saw the bigger picture. Kalen had just handed him the ultimate political weapon. By binding herself to a human, she had proven the king's bloodline was corrupted by madness and weakness. Vargas turned to his closest lieutenants, his voice a low, gravelly whisper. The time for diplomatic maneuvering was over. He ordered his men to begin mobilizing the clan's private military assets, a shadow army he had been building in secret for a decade. The High Council would soon need a new, stronger ruler to purge this sickness from the throne, and Vargas intended to be the one sitting on it. The true question was whether his newly acquired orbital disruptors would be ready before the king realized he was entirely surrounded. Meanwhile, Elias found himself forcibly scrubbed by automated sanitation drones and thrust into a guest chamber that was larger than his entire underground workshop. The room was a sickening display of wealth, featuring spun silk sheets, levitating light fixtures, and a balcony overlooking the floating gardens. Elias hated it immediately. The air smelled too clean, devoid of the comforting scents of ozone, engine oil, and honest labor. He paced the floor, tapping the hydrospanner against his thigh, calculating the odds of surviving a jump from the balcony to the nearest transport rail. The heavy oak doors slid open, and Kalen stepped inside. The ceremonial armor was gone, replaced by tactical leather and dark, reinforced fabric that suited her wild nature far better. She locked the doors behind her and engaged a small, disc-shaped device on the wall. A low hum filled the room, dampening all sound and disabling the palace's internal surveillance network. Elias stopped pacing. "I assume this is the part where you explain why you just painted a massive target on my back, Your Highness. Because if this is a complicated kidnapping for ransom, you picked the poorest man in the lower sectors. My net worth is currently 3 spools of copper wire and half a sandwich." Kalen crossed the room, her amber eyes locking onto his. The feral intensity was still there, but the manic energy of the throne room had vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating sharpness. She did not bring him here to be a pawn in a political game. She brought him here because he was a tool she desperately required. She explained the truth. For months, Kalen had been slipping away from her royal duties to map the irradiated feral zones, the dangerous, untamed regions of Lycaean Prime that the High Council strictly forbade anyone from entering. Deep within an area known as the Ashen Basin, She had detected a signal. It was not a Lycaean frequency. It was ancient, heavily encrypted, and entirely human. It was a remnant from the original colonization ships that had arrived centuries before the genetic tampering began. Our technology is built on biological integration, Kalen explained, pacing with the fluid grace of a hunting cat. Our scanners, our decryptors, our entire planetary network cannot interface with pure, archaic human hardware. It is a blind spot. I found a buried terminal, but I cannot read the data, and I cannot risk exposing it to the High Council. They would destroy it to maintain their absolute control over our history. Elias leaned against a marble pillar, crossing his arms. So, you caused a massive political scandal, infuriated a warlord, and dragged me into the most dangerous building on the planet, all because you need technical support? I need an engineer who is not bound by the biorhythms of my people. Kalen corrected him. I need someone who can bypass pre-splicing firewalls. You did not flinch when I crashed into your domain. You did not submit. That makes you uniquely qualified to survive the feral zones with me. Elias weighed his options. He could refuse, and likely be executed by Vargas's assassins before he even made it back to the lower city. Or he could journey into a toxic wasteland with a volatile, violently dangerous princess to poke at ancient machinery that was probably rigged to explode. I charge triple my standard rate for out-of-sector hazard pay, Elias said, his tone entirely serious. And I want complete access to the royal salvage yards when we return. Unrestricted. Plus, you replace the beryllium I lost when you decided to use my roof as a landing pad. Kalen let out a sharp, unexpected laugh. It was a genuine sound, entirely devoid of the court's usual venom. You demand payment from royalty while standing in a locked room with an alpha? I demand payment for fixing things, Elias shot back, unblinking. And it sounds like your ancient terminal is very broken. Do we have a deal? Or should I call the guards and tell them this was all a terrible misunderstanding? Kalen extended her hand, the grip firm and calloused. Elias took it, sealing a remarkably pragmatic partnership. It was a dangerous alliance built on necessity, bound by a shared disdain for the stifling rules of their respective societies. As they began mapping out their covert escape from the capital, a strange, undeniable mutual respect began to take root between the feral royal and the grease-stained mechanic. They just had to hope they could decipher the dead zone's secrets before the darkness buried beneath the ash decided to wake up. Sneaking out of a heavily fortified floating citadel was shockingly simple. Surviving the irradiated hellscape that lay beneath it was where the real nightmare began. Kalen and Elias slipped past the royal perimeter using a garbage chute designed for organic waste, a highly effective route that dumped them straight into the scavenger outskirts of the capital. From there, they began a brutal trek on foot into the Ashen Basin. The feral zones of Lycaeon Prime were a stark contrast to the sterilized chrome of the high society above. Here, the air was thick with a rust-colored mist that tasted distinctly like battery acid. The landscape was a sprawling graveyard of jagged obsidian rock and towering mutated fungal growths that pulsed with a sickening bioluminescence. Kalen moved through this hostile terrain with breathtaking fluidity. She was in her element. Her enhanced senses tracked micro-changes in wind and temperature, and her boots barely made a sound against the brittle ash. Elias followed close behind, sweating profusely inside a heavy environmental coat he had salvaged from his workshop, hauling a modified rucksack full of tools, power cells, and high-yield explosives. Their first real test came near a canyon composed entirely of petrified wood. A pack of stalker hounds caught their scent. These were not the noble, genetically perfected wolves of Kalen's lineage. They were hideous, hairless mutations, the tragic result of centuries of unregulated radiation. They boasted elongated limbs and jaws powerful enough to snap a steel girder in half. 6 of them slinked out of the acidic fog, their eyes glowing a dull, hungry red. Kaelin drew a pair of curved carbon steel blades from her thighs, dropping into a low crouch. She told Elias to stay back, but the human was already working. He dumped his rucksack, rapidly stringing a line of highly conductive wire between 2 petrified stumps. He jammed a high-capacity power cell into the ground, linking it directly to the wire. The first stalker hound lunged. Kaelin met it mid-air, spinning with impossible grace, her blade slicing cleanly through the creature's thick neck. Dark blood sprayed across the ash. 2 more rushed her from the flanks. She ducked under a snapping jaw, driving her knee into one beast's ribcage with a sickening impact, then pivoted to slash the other across the eyes. But 3 more beasts were circling wide, ignoring the alpha entirely and zeroing in on the slower, softer human. They charged Elias. He did not run. He waited until the lead beast crossed the invisible threshold of his trap, then slammed his boot down on the trigger plate. A blinding arc of blue plasma erupted from the conductive wire, catching all 3 hounds in a localized energy net. They convulsed and collapsed, the smell of singed flesh mixing with the acidic fog. Kaelin finished off the remaining hound and turned, wiping dark blood from her cheek, staring at the smoking crater in front of Elias. Elias nudged one of the twitching carcasses with his toe. He calmly remarked that he preferred his wild game well done. Kaelin let out a huff of genuine amusement, sheathing her blades. It was a flawless synergy of raw, primal violence and calculated human ingenuity. They made a terrifyingly effective team, deeper into the ashen basin. The toxic mist began to thin, revealing a massive, unnatural crater. At the center of the depression lay the source of the anomaly. It was not a small communications relay or a crashed scout ship as Kaelin had originally suspected. It was a colossal, metallic monolith, half buried in centuries of hardened ash and overgrown with metallic vines. The architecture was entirely alien to the biosynthetic aesthetics of the Lycaean high society. It consisted of sharp angles, heavy plating, and distinct blocky lettering that had not been used in hundreds of years. Elias ran a gloved hand over the hull, his eyes wide with genuine awe. He identified it instantly as a Vanguard-class colony ship, one of the original human vessels that brought his ancestors to this system long before the genetic splicing era began. It was a ghost ship, a massive relic from a forgotten epoch. Kaelin led him to a fissure in the hull where the metal had buckled, allowing them access to the dark, cavernous interior. They navigated through slanted corridors and collapsed bulkheads until they reached what looked like a secondary command center. Dead screens and fossilized control panels lined the walls. Elias dropped his rucksack and got to work. He bypassed the biological scanners that were useless down here, splicing his modern power cells directly into the archaic copper wiring of the main console. He worked for hours, muttering to himself, stripping wires with his teeth and coaxing life back into a system that had been asleep for generations. Suddenly, the room bathed in a pale, flickering green light. A holographic interface sputtered to life, projecting a massive 3-dimensional map of the Lycaean star system. Kaelin stepped forward, mesmerized by the ancient technology. She asked what they were looking at. Elias's hands flew across the physical keyboard, translating the archaic data streams. His expression shifted from triumph to profound dread. He explained that this was not just a colony ship. It was a grounded command node for a planetary defense grid, designed to protect the early settlers from extreme cosmic events. The ship had woken up because its deep space sensors had detected something massive. Elias pointed to a cluster of angry red data points moving rapidly across the holographic projection. a spatial anomaly. A concentrated wave of dark matter and highly charged radiation was tearing through their solar system. It was a planet killer. The biological sensors used by the High Council in the capital were designed to detect organic threats and localized atmospheric changes. They were completely blind to this specific type of deep space cosmic radiation. The anomaly was hurtling straight for Lycaon Prime. According to the ancient ship's calculations, they had less than 5 days before the wave hit, stripping the atmosphere and incinerating every living thing on the surface. A heavy silence fell over the command center. The political squabbles of the Alpha Court, the coup Lord Vargas was undoubtedly planning, the rigid laws of pure-blood society, all of it was instantly meaningless in the face of absolute annihilation. They retreated to a relatively intact observation deck near the top of the buried ship to rest for the night. Elias managed to ignite a small, smokeless chemical fire in an empty barrel. They sat across from each other, the flickering light casting long shadows against the rusted bulkheads. Kaylin stared into the flames, her usual fierce posture softening. Stripped of the royal armor and the heavy expectations of her bloodline, she looked incredibly tired. She spoke quietly, her voice lacking the booming authority of the Alpha. She confessed that she had never wanted the throne. The constant posturing, the endless cruelty disguised as tradition, the suffocating need to be a flawless, unfeeling predator. It was a cage she had been trying to break out of her entire life. She came to the feral zones because here, survival was honest. You fought, you lived, or you died. There were no poisoned chalices or whispered betrayals. Elias listened, handing her a ration bar. He told her that he understood perfectly. The lower sectors were no different, just poorer and dirtier. People stepped on each other to get an extra inch of breathing room in the smog. He preferred the company of machines because a broken engine never lied to you. It just stopped working until you fixed it. Kaylin looked up, meeting his eyes. In the dim light, the stark differences between them, the genetically perfect apex predator and the grease-stained human mechanic, seemed to vanish. There was a profound, quiet understanding between them, a shared loneliness that had finally found an echo. Kaylin reached out, her calloused fingers gently brushing against his arm. It was a hesitant gesture, entirely devoid of alpha dominance. It was merely a woman seeking comfort from a man she trusted. Elias did not pull away. He covered her hand with his own, the warmth of their touch grounding them against the terrifying reality of the approaching storm. For a long moment, the impending apocalypse and the wrath of the High Council faded into the background. But peace in the Ashen Basin was always an illusion. Deep within the bowels of the colony ship, a massive power relay shifted, sending a loud, echoing groan through the metal superstructure. The energy spike Elias had used to power the console had bled out into the surrounding soil. They had found the terrifying truth, but they had also broadcasted their exact location to anyone actively scanning for an anomalous power signature. They were sitting on the only weapon capable of saving their world, but they still had absolutely no idea how to pull the trigger, and company was undoubtedly on the way. Treason was always a matter of timing, and Lord Vargas possessed a watchmaker's precision. While Kaylin and Elias were unearthing ancient ghosts in the toxic wastes of the Ashen Basin, the high society citadels of Lycaon Prime were plunging into a meticulously orchestrated nightmare. Vargas marched into the royal throne room not as a humble subject, but as a conqueror leading a shadow army. He had spent a decade quietly replacing the king's most loyal security commanders with his own sycophants, buying their allegiance with smuggled credits and promises of pure-blood supremacy. As the Alpha King rose to demand an explanation for the sudden intrusion of heavily armed, unregistered mercenaries, the royal guard simply stood aside. The betrayal was absolute. Vargas locked the king in his own chambers, sealing the massive doors with a localized stasis field. standing before the panicked remnants of the High Council. Vargas declared martial law. He masterfully spun Kalen's rejection of his son and her subsequent flight with a lower caste human as undeniable proof of genetic madness. The royal bloodline was tainted. He proclaimed corrupted by a pathetic sympathy for a lesser species. He officially branded Princess Kalen a traitor to her biology and a threat to planetary security. To ensure the threat was permanently neutralized, Vargas unleashed his prized secret weapon. He bypassed the traditional royal hunters, dispatching a covert squad of cybernetically enhanced assassins known as the Iron Fangs. These killers were an abomination against Lycaean law, having traded their natural regenerative healing and pureblood status for illegal, black market augments. Their bones were laced with titanium, their eyes replaced with thermal targeting optics, and their nervous systems wired directly into combat stim injectors. They were faster, completely devoid of empathy, and utterly relentless. Vargas gave them one simple directive: bring back the princess's head and leave the human to rot in the ash. Hundreds of miles away, deep within the buried hull of the Vanguard-class colony ship, the ancient tactical screen suddenly flared from a muted green to a blaring, hostile crimson. Elias dropped his ration bar, instantly sliding across the rusted floor plating toward the main console. He tapped frantically at the keys, analyzing the sudden spike in localized telemetry. Kalen was already on her feet, her blades drawn, her amber eyes scanning the dark, cavernous entry points of the ship. Her enhanced senses picked up the threat before Elias could even read the data. She smelled the bitter tang of synthetic blood and the unnatural ozone discharge of active cloaking fields. A heavy, unnatural thud echoed from the corridor outside the command center. Then came another, and another, until the sound of synchronized metallic footsteps filled the air. Elias shouted a warning, confirming that multiple hostiles had breached the hull and were moving with extreme tactical precision. He abandoned the main console, diving behind a massive fossilized power conduit as the heavy blast doors of the command center were violently blown completely off their hinges. 6 of Vargas's enhanced assassins stormed into the room. They moved with a terrifying, jerky speed, their optical sensors glowing a harsh, sickly yellow in the dim light. Kalen did not wait for them to establish a firing line. She pushed off a heavy console, launching herself directly into the center of their formation. She was a whirlwind of primal fury. Kalen ducked under a sweeping monomolecular blade from the lead assassin, driving her own carbon steel weapon directly into the vulnerable joint of his armored knee. The man did not even flinch, his pain receptors entirely disabled by his augments. He simply pivoted and backhanded her with a titanium-laced gauntlet, sending Kalen crashing into a bank of dead monitors. Elias realized instantly that Kalen's raw strength and feral agility were not enough against enemies who felt absolutely no pain. He needed to change the mathematics of the fight. He scrambled toward a secondary terminal that controlled the ship's internal security measures. The system was archaic, locked behind a primitive text-based firewall that no modern Lycaean hacker would even recognize. But to Elias, it was like reading a children's book. He spliced his hydrospanner into the data port, overriding the localized safeties and manually acquiring targeting control of the room's automated point defense turrets. Kalen recovered rapidly, rolling beneath a hail of plasma fire from 2 assassins. She used the tight quarters of the command center to her advantage, vaulting off the walls and severing the optical cables on a 3rd attacker's neck, blinding him before kicking him down an open elevator shaft. But the remaining 3 were closing in, their movements perfectly synchronized, boxing her into a corner. Suddenly, twin heavy slug turrets dropped from hidden compartments in the ceiling. Elias yelled for Kalen to drop to the floor. She instantly flattened herself against the deck plating. Elias slammed his fist onto the manual execution key. The ancient turrets roared to life, unleashing a devastating torrent of high-caliber, armor-piercing kinetic rounds. The archaic weapons were terrifyingly effective. They tore through the advanced kinetic shielding of the assassins, ripping through their titanium augments and pinning them to the far wall in a spray of sparks and synthetic fluid. Silence descended on the command center, broken only by the heavy, ragged breathing of the princess and the hum of the cooling turrets. Elias leaned heavily against the console, wiping a smear of grease and sweat from his forehead. He remarked casually that he had always appreciated the robust nature of antique home defense systems. Kaylin slowly got to her feet, her chest heaving. She walked deliberately toward the single assassin who had survived the barrage. The man was severely crippled, his cybernetic legs completely shattered, dragging himself across the floor with one functioning arm. Kaylin stood over him, her face an unreadable mask of predatory coldness. She raised her blade, positioning the tip directly over the assassin's organic heart. It was the ancient law of the pack. A challenger who sought your life forfeited their own. Mercy was a concept reserved for the weak, a flaw that invited future rebellion. She tensed her arm to deliver the killing strike. Elias stepped out from behind the console and firmly grabbed her wrist. Kaylin whipped her head around, her eyes flashing dangerously. She ordered him to let go, her voice dropping into a low, terrifying register that commanded absolute obedience from anyone else on the planet. Elias did not release his grip. He looked at the defeated assassin, then back to Kaylin, his expression completely devoid of fear. He told her that if she drove that blade through the man's chest, she was no different than Vargas. He argued that ruling through absolute terror and the eradication of enemies was exactly what had turned the High Council into a stagnant, corrupt aristocracy. They were standing in the ruins of an ancient civilization that had destroyed itself because it failed to evolve past its own violent instincts. Elias stated plainly that a true alpha did not just slaughter their way to the top. A true leader had the strength to break the cycle of violence, to show restraint when the entire world expected a massacre. He reminded her that they had less than a week before a cosmic anomaly wiped them all out anyway, and dying with clean hands was entirely preferable to dying as a tyrant. Kaylin stared at the human, the rigid doctrines of her upbringing warring against the undeniable truth in his words. She looked down at the assassin, who was watching her with a mixture of defiance and genuine confusion. He had expected to die. The fact that he was still drawing breath shattered his understanding of the royal bloodline. Slowly, the feral intensity in Kaylin's posture dissolved. She lowered her weapon and stepped back, releasing a long, heavy sigh. She told the broken assassin to crawl back to Vargas and deliver a message. She instructed him to tell the usurper that the true heir to Lycaon Prime was coming for him, and she was bringing the fire of the ancients with her. Elias offered Kaylin a small, approving smile, recognizing the monumental internal shift she had just made. It was a terrifying vulnerability for an alpha to show mercy, but it cemented his belief that she was the only one fit to save their world. However, their victory was incredibly short-lived. As Elias turned back to the main console to check the planetary defense grid status, the holographic projection shifted. The anomaly was accelerating. The dark matter wave was feeding on the ambient energy of the solar system, increasing its mass and speed exponentially. The estimated time of impact dropped from 5 days to less than 48 hours. They had spared the assassin, proving Kaylin's worth as a new kind of leader. But they had also given Vargas a direct eyewitness to their survival and their exact location. Activating the shield required unlocking the very core of the colony ship. A process Elias had just discovered involved a security measure so profoundly dangerous. It made the squad of cybernetic killers look like a minor inconvenience. They needed to merge their minds with the ship's central intelligence, A brutal neural link that would either give them the keys to the planetary defense grid or entirely erase their consciousnesses, leaving their bodies as empty husks in the dark. The heart of the Vanguard-class colony ship was not a machine, but a dormant god waiting for a sacrifice. Kalen and Elias were about to offer it their minds. The descent into the ship's primary core took them away from the rusted, buckled metal of the upper decks and into a pristine, climate-controlled sanctuary. Here, the air was cold and sterile, entirely untouched by the centuries of toxic ash above. At the center of a massive circular chamber, suspended in a zero-gravity containment field, hung the central artificial intelligence matrix. It was a colossal, faceted crystal, pulsing with a slow, rhythmic, bioluminescent blue light. Elias approached the primary control terminal, his hands moving over the glass-smooth surface. The interface was entirely holographic, responding instantly to his genetic signature as a baseline human. He worked rapidly, bypassing the slumbering maintenance protocols and demanding direct access to the planetary defense grid. The crystalline matrix flared a brilliant, blinding white. A voice, genderless and perfectly synthesized, echoed through the chamber, vibrating in their very teeth. It announced that the localized atmospheric threat protocols were acknowledged. However, the final authorization sequence required a dual heritage biometric key. Elias read the scrolling ancient text, his face draining of color. He looked back at Kalen, his voice tight with apprehension. The architects of this ship had foreseen the biological divergence of their colony. They understood that the early genetic tampering would inevitably create a schism, a world divided by bloodlines and biology. To prevent either faction from using the planetary shield as a hostage or a weapon, the system required two minds to unlock it simultaneously. One had to be a pure, unmodified human. The other had to be the apex of the new Lycaon evolution. They had to connect to the neural link interface, a pair of metallic halo-like devices suspended over two reclined command chairs facing the crystal. The AI would bridge their consciousnesses, filtering the authorization through their combined memories and emotional states to ensure their intent was to protect the planet, not conquer it. Elias warned her that early human neural link technology was brutal. It lacked the refined biological dampeners of modern Lycaon tech. It was going to tear down every mental wall they had ever built if they fought the intrusion, or if they rejected what they saw in each other's minds. The feedback loop would instantly liquefy their frontal lobes. Kalen did not hesitate. She walked to the left chair and sat down, pulling the heavy metallic halo down over her head. She looked at the human mechanic who had tumbled into her life mere days ago. The man who had stood by her against impossible odds and challenged the very foundation of her violent upbringing. She told him that she trusted him more than she had ever trusted her own blood. Elias swallowed hard, taking the right chair and engaging his own halo. He locked eyes with the feral princess, offering a final reassuring nod. He reached out and pressed the physical execution switch on the armrest. The world dissolved into absolute, agonizing white. It felt as though 1,000 heated needles were driving directly through their skulls. Kalen gasped, her body locking rigid against the restraints, while Elias gripped the armrests until his knuckles bruised. The pain was entirely blinding. A total sensory overload as the ancient quantum computer forcibly tore down the barriers of their individual egos. Then, the pain vanished, replaced by an overwhelming flood of shared existence. Kalen was suddenly thrust into Elias's consciousness. She tasted the grit of the lower sectors on his tongue. She felt the gnawing, hollow ache of hunger he had endured as a child. She experienced the crushing grief of watching his parents succumb to preventable industrial lung rot, a direct result of the High Council's negligent resource allocation. But beneath the hardship, she felt his profound, unshakable resilience. She felt his quiet, steady determination to build, to fix, to create order out of chaos. Most startling of all, she felt his perception of her. She saw herself through his eyes, not as a terrifying monster, not as a political pawn, but as a breathtakingly fierce, tragically isolated warrior who desperately needed someone to simply stand beside her. Simultaneously, Elias plummeted into Kaylin's mind. The sheer primal intensity of her sensory input was staggering. He felt the terrifying, blood-soaked weight of the alpha expectations pressing down on her since childhood. He experienced the sickening crunch of bone from her early combat trials, the relentless, cold cruelty she was forced to inflict just to survive the viper's nest of her own family. He felt her profound, suffocating loneliness, the agonizing realization that she was an apex predator trapped in a glass cage of tradition, surrounded by sycophants who would never understand her wild heart. In the ethereal space of the neural link, their minds collided, tangled, and ultimately embraced. There were no secrets left, no posturing, no royal titles, and no lower caste shame. The shared trauma and mutual admiration forged an unbreakable tether. The pragmatic alliance they had struck in a ruined workshop transformed in a fraction of a second. It solidified into a fierce, absolute love, a bond deeper than biology or politics. They were two broken halves of a fractured planet, perfectly aligned in the dark. The central AI judged their intent, measured their combined resolve, and found them worthy. With a violent gasp, Kaylin and Elias were thrown back into their physical bodies. The metallic halos disengaged, retracting into the ceiling. They sat in the command chairs, chests heaving, completely drenched in cold sweat. Kaylin turned her head slowly, her amber eyes locking onto Elias. The feral sharpness was still there, but it was softened by a profound, naked vulnerability. Elias reached across the space between the chairs, his hand shaking slightly. Kaylin took it, intertwining her fingers tightly with his. No words were necessary. They both knew exactly what had just happened, and they both knew they would burn the galaxy to ash before letting anything tear them apart. A deep, resonant hum vibrated through the floorboards. The crystalline matrix shifted from blue to a brilliant, burning gold. The primary console lit up with thousands of green tactical markers. Elias pulled himself to the monitor, his eyes scanning the archaic data feeds. He let out a breath of pure relief. The planetary defense grid was waking up. The system was engaging the orbital sat nodes, weaving a kinetic and radiation-absorbent mesh across the upper stratosphere. But the relief was fractured instantly. A harsh, blaring siren erupted from the console. The grid was drawing power from the planet's core. But centuries of neglect had degraded the main transmission conduits. The shield was only deploying at 40% capacity, creating a localized, highly concentrated dome of energy directly above the ashen basin instead of wrapping the entire globe. Worse still, the massive influx of geothermal energy required to jumpstart the ancient systems had to vent somewhere. A colossal pillar of golden light erupted from the buckled hull of the colony ship, tearing through the toxic smog of the feral zones and shooting straight into the black sky. It was a beacon visible from every floating citadel on Lycaon Prime. Kaylin stood up, her instincts flaring as she looked at the tactical map. She knew exactly what that pillar of light meant. The surviving assassin had warned Vargas, and now, the usurper had a giant glowing target painting their exact coordinates. Vargas would not send a handful of assassins this time. He would send his entire shadow army to seize the ultimate weapon before the cosmic anomaly hit. They had the key to saving the world, but the door was stuck halfway open, and a legion of killers was marching straight toward the light. An army of heavily armed usurpers was descending upon a graveyard of toxic ash. But Lord Vargas was about to learn a brutal lesson about cornering a feral wolf in her own den. The golden pillar of light shooting from the Vanguard-class colony ship was a beacon that cut cleanly through the acidic smog, and within an hour, the sky above the ashen basin grew dark with the descending silhouettes of Vargas's shadow army. Massive armored dropships dropped from the clouds like mechanical vultures, disgorging hundreds of elite, pure-blood mercenaries and heavy hover tanks directly into the crater. Vargas stood arrogantly atop a heavily armored command transport, his reptilian eyes fixed on the glowing ancient hull. He did not care about the cosmic anomaly hurtling toward their world. He only cared that whoever controlled this ancient, godlike defense grid controlled the undeniable future of Lycaon Prime. With a sharp gesture, he ordered his battalion to encircle the ship, set up heavy artillery lines, and prepare to breach the primary airlocks. Inside the ship, the atmosphere was a bizarre, highly pressurized mix of impending doom and domestic bickering. Elias was frantically stripping thick copper wires from a massive fossilized cooling unit, wiring them directly to a cluster of unstable plasma batteries he had scavenged from the lower maintenance decks. He was building improvised proximity mines, loudly cursing the severe lack of basic safety standards in ancient human architecture. Kaylin stood nearby, sharply scraping her carbon steel blades against a piece of obsidian, watching him with a mixture of profound amusement and deep affection. She teased him relentlessly, pointing out that an alpha royal consort should absolutely not have machinery grease permanently tattooed to his forehead. Elias shot back without ever looking up from his makeshift detonator, reminding her that he was currently the only thing standing between her and a heavily armed firing squad, so she could tolerate a little honest grime. The intense neural link they had shared had completely stripped away all their emotional defenses, leaving behind a raw, undeniable intimacy. They moved in perfect synchronization, anticipating each other's thoughts and actions without uttering a single command. The crushing weight of their respective worlds had vanished, replaced by a fierce, protective partnership. The first heavy explosions violently rocked the outer hull. Vargas's men were blowing the archaic airlocks. Kaylin's demeanor instantly shifted from playful partner to lethal apex predator. She instructed Elias to lock down the heavily reinforced command center doors and not to open them unless she gave the specific all-clear signal, or unless he confirmed she was dead. Before Elias could voice a single protest, she slipped out into the darkened, slanted corridors of the ship's outer ring. She knew this treacherous terrain intimately, and she knew exactly how pure-blood aristocratic soldiers fought. They relied entirely on their expensive kinetic shielding, heavy squad tactics, and overwhelming firepower. But in the claustrophobic, rusted labyrinth of a buried colony ship, those advantages were completely useless. A squad of 5 heavily armored mercenaries set up a heavy plasma mortar in a collapsed hangar bay, intending to blow a massive hole straight down into the command core. Kaylin dropped from the rusted rafters like a shadow detached from the wall. She did not roar. She simply executed. Her first strike cleanly severed the highly pressurized fuel line of the mortar, as the volatile, glowing liquid sprayed wildly across the deck. She vaulted off the massive gun barrel, driving her armored knee directly into the faceplate of the squad leader and sending him crashing backward into his own men. Before the disoriented soldiers could raise their heavy rifles, Elias's improvised proximity mines, which Kaylin had discreetly planted along the main entryway moments before, detonated in a blinding flash of volatile blue energy. The concussive shockwave instantly neutralized the kinetic shields of the remaining soldiers, allowing Kaylin to finish them off with terrifying, silent efficiency. She became a ghost haunting the metallic corridors, systematically dismantling Vargas's heavy artillery teams one by one and leaving a trail of broken mercenaries in the dark. Down in the ash-choked crater, Vargas quickly realized his elite vanguard squads were going entirely silent. Furious and impatient, he abandoned his surgical approach. He ordered his line of heavy hover tanks to align their primary cannons and unleash a blind, concentrated barrage of high-yield plasma directly into the ship's massive superstructure. The earth beneath the ashen basin violently trembled. Successive waves of searing, destructive energy slammed mercilessly into the ancient metal hull. The colony ship groaned in agony, its rusted internal bulkheads buckling and twisting under the immense, unrelenting pressure. In the primary command center, Elias was thrown brutally against the main console as the entire room shook with catastrophic force. Blaring red warning lights instantly flooded the chamber, entirely drowning out the steady, reassuring golden glow of the planetary shield matrix. A massive surge of uncontrolled, raw energy arced dangerously across the ceiling panels, followed immediately by a deafening, sickening explosion deep within the reinforced walls. The holographic projection of the planetary shield abruptly froze at exactly 40% coverage. Elias scrambled frantically back to his feet, his fingers flying across the archaic keyboard to run a desperately fast diagnostic check. The readout confirmed his absolute worst fear. The immense concussive force from Vargas's tank barrage had completely severed the primary power relay connecting the geothermal core to the orbital sat nodes. The internal circuits were fried beyond repair, fused into useless, smoking slag. The shield could not expand to cover the planet. Lycaon Prime was utterly exposed to the incoming wave of dark matter. Elias desperately searched the ancient schematics for a secondary routing option, his eyes darting across the glowing green lines of data. He found only one viable path. The original human engineers, deeply paranoid about catastrophic system failures, had installed a manual hardware override. It was a physical, heavy-duty breaker designed to force the raw power through an auxiliary exterior circuit if the internal lines were compromised. Elias looked closer at the structural schematic, his blood running entirely cold. The override switch was not safely tucked away in a shielded engine room or a reinforced maintenance shaft. It was located on the ship's exterior hull, directly adjacent to the main communication array. To manually flip the switch and push the planetary shield to full global coverage, someone had to walk out onto the completely exposed, slanted surface of the ship's outer plating. They had to step directly out of the protective shadows and right into the crosshairs of 100 pure-blood mercenaries and a formidable line of heavy hover tanks. Vargas's entire army was out there, their weapons trained on the hull, waiting to unleash absolute hell on the very first thing that dared to move into their line of sight. The cosmic clock was ticking down to total planetary annihilation, and the only remaining path to survival required a suicidal sprint into a wall of unrelenting, concentrated plasma fire. The heavy question of who would make that impossible run hung suffocatingly in the air. A final, brutal test of the unbreakable bond they had just forged in the dark. A hero's death was a luxury strictly reserved for the genetically perfect. But Elias Thorne was about to prove that sheer human stubbornness could outshine 1,000 years of pure-blood arrogance. The command center of the Vanguard ship felt like a tomb, as the realization of the severed power relay settled heavily over the room. Kaylin slipped back through the reinforced doors, her blades slick with the synthetic fluids of Vargas's Vanguard troops. She took one look at the holographic display and the color drained from her face. Elias did not sugarcoat the situation. He pointed to the structural schematic, outlining the exact location of the manual override switch on the exposed outer hull. Kaylin immediately stepped toward the airlock, stating she would make the run. She was an alpha, possessing the agility and speed required to dodge a localized barrage. Elias firmly grabbed her arm, stopping her dead in her tracks. He pointed to a secondary monitor displaying the atmospheric radiation levels outside the ship's localized energy dome. The approaching cosmic anomaly was already stripping the upper atmosphere, flooding the surface with dark matter radiation. He explained that her highly sensitive, genetically enhanced cellular structure would aggressively absorb the radiation, causing her blood to boil before she even reached the switch. His baseline human biology, dull and unrefined by comparison, would grant him an extra 60 seconds of coherent movement. Kaylin's eyes flashed with furious denial. She ordered him to find another way. Elias offered a dry, sad smile, pulling a heavy plasma welder from his belt. He told her that he was the mechanic, and fixing the broken roof was entirely in his job description. Before Kaylin could physically restrain him, Elias slammed his palm against the emergency bulkhead release, sealing Kaylin inside the heavily armored command center. Elias cycled the secondary airlock and stepped out into the apocalyptic nightmare of the Ashen Basin. The sky above was a terrifying canvas of bruised purple and violent black energy, the cosmic anomaly tearing into the edges of their solar system. The air tasted of burning copper and absolute ruin. Below him, the crater was swarming with Vargas's heavily armed battalion. The instant Elias's boot hit the rusted outer plating, 100 targeting lasers painted his chest in a constellation of deadly red light. Elias did not hesitate. He sprinted up the slanted, treacherous incline of the ship's hull, his heavy boots slipping against centuries of hardened ash. Lord Vargas sneered from his command transport, disgusted that Kaylin had sent her human pet to do her bidding. He gave the order to fire. A blinding torrent of plasma bolts and heavy kinetic slugs ripped through the air. Elias threw himself into a desperate slide behind a jagged ridge of buckled metal. Using his hydrospanner to jury-rig the heavy plasma welder into a localized magnetic deflector, the improvised shield flared brilliantly, absorbing the first wave of fatal strikes, but the sheer kinetic force shattered the device in his hands, throwing him violently backward. A searing beam of concentrated plasma clipped his right thigh. Elias hit the deck plating hard, the agonizing scent of his own burning flesh filling his nostrils. His leg was completely useless, the muscle cauterized and failing. He was entirely exposed, bleeding out on the hull, with the manual override switch still 30 yards away. Inside the command center, Kaylin watched Elias fall through the tactical monitors. A primal, world-shattering roar tore from her throat, echoing off the ancient bulkheads. She slammed her fists against the sealed blast doors, the reinforced metal denting under her frantic, terrifying strength. She could not lose him. She refused to let the rigid laws of her biology dictate who lived and who died. Her frantic eyes locked onto a sealed glass containment unit in the corner of the room. Inside rested a relic of the ancient human wars, a heavy biomechanical combat suit. For a pure-blood Lycaean, interfacing with heavy cybernetics or mechanical augmentation was the ultimate taboo, a vile corruption of their genetic perfection. It was the very reason Vargas's assassins were considered abominations. But Kaylin was done playing by the rules of a society that would rather die pure than live compromised. She shattered the containment glass with a single devastating blow. She hauled the heavy, imposing armor from its cradle. It required a direct neural spinal interface, a brutally invasive connection designed strictly for human physiology. Kaylin slammed her back against the open chassis, gritting her teeth as the ancient biometric needles violently pierced her spine, integrating the cold metal directly into her highly sensitive nervous system. The pain was astronomical, an explosive clash of biology and archaic technology. But the suit roared to life, its heavy particle shields flaring a brilliant, angry crimson. Outside, the heavy hover tanks pivoted their primary cannons, acquiring a definitive lock on the crippled human desperately dragging himself up the hull. Vargas raised his hand to order the final execution. The heavy titanium hull of the Vanguard ship violently exploded outward. Kaylin launched herself from the wreckage like an avenging deity, clad entirely in the massive mechanized armor of the ancients. She landed with an earth-shattering impact directly between Elias and the tank battalion. The primary cannons fired. A colossal wave of plasma engulfed her position. When the smoke cleared, Kaelin stood entirely unbroken, the suit's heavy particle shields absorbing the catastrophic blast. She did not give Vargas time to reload, leveraging her feral agility, massively amplified by the suit's hydraulic servos. She leaped entirely over the front lines. She landed squarely on the lead hover tank, driving her armored fists directly through its reinforced plating and ripping the primary power core completely out of its housing. Chaos consumed the usurper's army. Kaelin was an unstoppable force of nature wrapped in indestructible steel, tearing through the heavy artillery squads with a ferocious, calculated grace that defied every known law of combat. Elias watched the mechanical titan slaughter the front lines, a weak, breathless laugh escaping his lips. He dug his fingers into the grated decking, dragging his shattered body up the final agonizing incline. His vision was blurring, the edges of the world turning a dark, fuzzy gray. He reached the massive, heavy-duty breaker switch. He grabbed the lever with both hands, his muscles screaming in protest, with a final desperate surge of pure willpower. Elias pulled the switch down until it locked into place with a heavy, definitive mechanical thud. His strength completely gave out, and he collapsed against the cold metal hull, his eyes sliding shut. Deep within the earth, the Vanguard colony ship unleashed a deafening, triumphant roar. The localized golden pillar of light violently expanded. A massive, shimmering grid of raw geometric energy shot across the stratosphere, racing across the horizon to entirely envelop Lycaon Prime. Moments later, the cosmic anomaly struck. The sky detonated in an apocalyptic display of blinding colors, violently swirling dark matter crashing against the ancient human shield. The energy grid held firm, absorbing the planet-killing radiation and safely dissipating it into the void of space. Down in the crater, the sheer electromagnetic pulse of the planetary shield completely neutralized Vargas's remaining weaponry. Rifles powered down, hover tanks crashed heavily into the ash. The usurper fell to his knees, staring up at the terrifying, beautiful celestial firestorm contained above them. His grand army was utterly powerless, his worldview entirely shattered by the terrifying synergy of human grit and a compromised alpha. He dropped his useless sidearm into the dirt. The surviving mercenaries immediately followed suit, dropping to the ground in absolute terrified submission. The battle for Lycaon Prime was over, but the question of whether the human engineer would survive to see the new world he had just built remained painfully unanswered. Rebuilding a shattered world was always going to be a far messier business than simply stopping an apocalypse. Fortunately, Princess Kaelin had never been afraid of getting her hands dirty, and she had brought the absolute best mechanic on the planet to help her do it. The cosmic firestorm raged endlessly across the upper stratosphere, a terrifying, churning ocean of violent purple and black radiation crashing uselessly against the golden geometric grid of the planetary shield. The sheer force of the dark matter wave caused the very air inside the ashen basin to hum with an intense, static charge. Down in the crater, the silence was absolute. Kaelin forcefully disengaged the biomechanical neural link, tearing the heavy ancient armor from her bleeding spine. She ignored the excruciating pain radiating through her nervous system. Sprinting up the buckled, slanted hull of the Vanguard colony ship toward the motionless figure slumped against the manual override switch. Elias was barely breathing. His right leg was a ruined mess of cauterized flesh from the plasma strike, and his pulse was dangerously weak. He managed to pry one eye open as the feral princess dropped to her knees beside him, her hands frantic as she assessed his wounds. He offered a weak, lopsided grin, his voice a raspy whisper as he demanded double his standard hazard pay for personally saving the entire solar system. Kaelin did not laugh. She carefully gathered the fragile human into her arms, pressing her forehead against his. swearing a fierce oath to the ancient gods and the new stars alike that he was absolutely not going to die on this rusted hull. The return to the floating citadels of the capital was nothing short of a triumphal march. Yet it was entirely devoid of the traditional sanitized pomp the High Council usually demanded. Kaelin arrived in a commandeered heavy dropship, landing squarely in the center of the Grand Royal Plaza. She did not wear the immaculate ceremonial silks expected of an alpha heir. She wore her tactical leather, deeply stained with the toxic ash of the feral zones and the synthetic blood of the assassins who had tried to stop her. Behind her, a squad of heavily armed but fiercely loyal palace guards dragged Lord Vargas in heavy iron restraints. The usurper's grand rebellion had been completely crushed into dust by the very human ingenuity he had so deeply despised. The Alpha King was released from his localized stasis field just in time to witness his wild daughter march through the massive oak doors of the grand throne room. The hundreds of pure-blood aristocrats, who had spent the last 2 harrowing days cowering in the dark in absolute fear of Vargas and the cosmic annihilation raging above their heads, parted like a frightened sea. Kaelin did not wait for a royal summons, and she did not ask for permission to speak. She claimed the center of the room with the undeniable gravitational authority of a planetary savior. She threw Vargas to the polished marble floor directly at her father's feet. With a voice that commanded total obedience, she permanently stripped Vargas of his royal titles, seized his ancestral lands, and dissolved his military command. However, she blatantly refused to execute him. Breaking the oldest law of the pack, she sentenced the former warlord to a lifetime of grueling manual labor in the lowest, most polluted industrial sectors. It was a brutal, poetic justice that forced him to survive entirely powerless among the very human caste he had deemed unworthy of existence. But the feral princess was nowhere near finished. She turned her blazing amber eyes upon the trembling members of the High Council, her voice echoing with a dangerous, crystalline clarity. She declared that the archaic laws of pure-blood supremacy were officially and permanently dead. She laid bare the ugly truth, their precious genetic stagnation, which had bred nothing but political corruption and blind arrogance, had nearly cost them their entire world. Planetary survival had not come from their sharpened fangs, their engineered physical perfection, or their endless political scheming. It had come from a buried, rusted relic of their shared human past, and from the unwavering courage of a man who possessed no biological enhancements whatsoever. Right on cue, the grand doors of the Royal Medical Wing slid open, and Elias Thorne entered the throne room. He leaned heavily on a polished biosynthetic cane, his ruined leg encased in a sleek, highly advanced regenerative brace that he had personally rewired while still heavily sedated by the royal physicians. He looked entirely out of place amidst the cascading gold banners and pristine marble pillars. He was a grease-stained, lower-caste mechanic standing casually in the absolute center of global power. Kaelin walked slowly down from the dais and took his hand, intertwining her fingers with his for the entire court to see. Turning to face her father and the stunned assembly, she formally claimed Elias Thorne as her equal partner, her chief engineer, and her official alpha consort. The silence in the throne room was deafening, heavy with the weight of shattered paradigms. But not a single aristocrat dared to challenge her. They had all looked up and seen the sky burning, and they all knew exactly who had bled on the outer hull to forge the shield that kept them alive. The moral lesson of their terrifying ordeal was undeniable and brutally clear to everyone present. True strength was never rooted in biological dominance, the hoarding of technology, or the violent subjugation of those deemed lesser. True power came from the courage to bridge violently divided worlds, to embrace vulnerability in the face of absolute destruction, and to show mercy when the entire universe expected a massacre. Months later, the frantic, paranoid energy of the capital city had finally settled into a new, unprecedented rhythm of progress. The rigid, suffocating caste system was rapidly crumbling. Elite pureblood engineers were actively venturing down into the lower sectors, eager to learn archaic mechanical applications and raw problem-solving skills from human tradesmen. The massive royal salvage yards were opened to the public by royal decree, sparking a massive planet-wide renaissance of technological integration and shared prosperity. Kalen and Elias stood close together on a high, sweeping balcony overlooking the sprawling, glowing city. The toxic smog of the lower industrial sectors was slowly but surely dissipating. Actively cleared by massive atmospheric scrubbers Elias had designed using the Vanguard ship's ancient, uncorrupted schematics. High above them, the deadly cosmic anomaly had finally passed entirely, leaving behind a clear, breathtaking night sky filled with brilliant, unfamiliar constellations. Elias leaned comfortably against the cool marble railing, casually twirling a heavily customized hydro spanner in his left hand. He noted with a dry, sarcastic drawl that being the Alpha consort involved significantly more diplomatic paperwork and velvet clothing than he had originally anticipated, and he was seriously considering hiding back in his subterranean workshop for the rest of the week. Kalen stepped close to him, wrapping her strong arms around his waist and resting her chin softly against his chest. She smiled, a bright, genuinely warm expression that belonged entirely to him, completely devoid of her feral armor. She promised him quietly that if he dared to run, she would simply have to hunt him down through the alleyways all over again. Elias wrapped his arms around her shoulders, pressing a gentle kiss to the top of her head. Completely at peace with that arrangement, they stood together in the quiet night, looking out over a magnificent planet that was finally united, technologically secure, and still beautifully, unapologetically wild. Thank you so much for watching this story unfold. If you enjoyed this journey across Lycaon Prime, please make sure to like, subscribe, and share this video with your friends. Leave a comment down below with the word Alliance to let me know you made it to the very end. And do not forget to hit that hype button so this video can reach more sci-fi fans just like you.